The Kremlin did not sleep. The spring of 1538 smelled not of tulips, but of sulfur and vinegar. In the chambers of Grand Princess Elena Glinskaya, the flames of the candles trembled as if stirred by an invisible breath. Servants knelt in silence, afraid even to breathe. The regent of Russia, mother of the young Tsar Ivan, was suffocating. Chroniclers wrote that her skin began to turn blue before dawn. She drank kvass, and in it was a cold poison, noted a monk from the Trinity Sergius monastery. This was no herbal brew. They spoke of antimony, a woman's poison, without taste or smell. At court, such substances were kept under lock and key. Only 3 men had access: the German physician, the Greek cook, and a steward from the Shuisky clan. Within a week, all 3 vanished. But it wasn't only her death that raised suspicion. A day after her burial, Kremlin archivists quietly erased part of the record from the last Regency Council. The line where her name stood next to Ivan Telipnev Obolensky was drowned in ink. A secret, neat and bureaucratic, with no trace of blood. The official version said fever. The Novgorod chronicles recorded it differently. The Shuisky attendants gave her drink, and from it she perished. In the great illustrated chronicle of the time, there was a miniature, a woman with a goblet, above her 2 male faces, one hooded. The artist worked under state supervision, yet left the faces unrecognized, a symbol in itself. In the Pagodin archive survives a sheet with a crossed-out note. The night was clear. The widow, the great Elena, tasted the drink, and flame entered her womb. In the 16th century, flame was the word used to describe the inner burning of arsenic poisoning. Curiously, just a week before her death, she had signed a decree on a new coin, the kopeck. Instead of a cross, it bore the image of a horseman, a symbol of princely power, not of boyar grace. Some whispered it was this reform, more than her love for Telipnev, that cost her life. When her body was carried out at dawn, a whisper ran through the courtyard. She has died, but she has not forgiven. One old servant swore that in her final moment, Elena raised her hand as if to bless her son, but her fingers clenched tight, nails piercing her palm. Among the people it was said, if the dead do not release their hands, they will drag their betrayers with them. 3 days later, the Shuiskys launched their coup. At the same time, the first ban on the name Telipnev Obolensky appeared. And in monastic chronicles, a new phrase was written: the widow's disease, a curse that haunted court women, that any who betrayed a widow would die in childbirth. So the death of Elena Glinskaya became a myth, the poison became a symbol, and the silence of the Kremlin became its own kind of document. 6 years of rule, 2 sons, 1 reform, and a single cup, from which an era of madness began. From that moment on, the palace grew quiet as a tomb. At night no lamps were lit, and the guards patrolled with eyes lowered. The air smelled of wax and cold. This was the scent of power once it had been orphaned. On the throne remained only a child of 3, Ivan Vasilyevich. His crown weighed more than he did. The boyars gathered in the Cathedral of the Assumption as if they were attending the funeral of the empire itself. In the church books of that year, one short line survives. And thereafter, princes rose against one another, and turmoil began. Not poetry, but a diagnosis. A country ruled by a child was turning into a battlefield for whoever could reach his cradle. The Shuiskys, an ancient family, proud descendants of Rurik, saw themselves as rightful guardians. But nearby stood the Belskys, Elena's kin, with ties still stretching to Lithuania. Each clan looked at the small Ivan not as a child, but as a seal with which to stamp decrees. One court scribe wrote that in the boys' chambers there were more armed guards than nurses. Everyone feared the child would be stolen, while each secretly dreamed of stealing him themselves. Twice in the first weeks after his mother's death, he was moved from one wing of the Kremlin to another to avoid plots. Some claimed the Shuiskys even tried to forge the Tsar's signature using a wax seal with the initials IV, a tiny cipher carved in secret. But the letter they sent sparked a scandal. The wax imprint was reversed, a mirror image. The forgery was exposed. Meanwhile, the boy remained silent. Witnesses said he looked at people with an otherworldly gaze, as if he already understood that silence was more dangerous than battle. His nurses whispered. Ivan never cried, only watched. He disliked being touched, refused to let anyone wipe his hands after meals. He insisted on doing everything himself, like an adult. Later chroniclers would say that it was in these days, between cradle and throne, that the character was born which history would call the Terrible. His childhood was not games, but watching grown men kill each other without drawing their swords. One night, according to the monk Macarius, little Ivan left his room and stood a long time at the doors of his mother's chamber. A eunuch on duty swore the boy whispered, "Mother sleeps, but there are too many of them." No one knew whom he meant. But the next day, one of the Belskys disappeared. Historians still debate who truly ruled in those months. Officially, it was the Council of Boyars. In reality, it was fear. Every morning, someone lost their title. Every evening, someone else gained one. In Moscow, a grim saying was born. By day you are a prince, by night you are a corpse or a captive. Without his mother, Ivan was not just alone. He became a living banner around wolves gathered. The Kremlin turned into a child's prison, where toys were seals of state and lullabies were whispers of intrigue. And in that silence, the child learned to see what mattered most, who looked at him with pity and who with calculation. Years later, he would tell his companions, "I was raised by lies. That is why I learned to love fear." But it began here, in that spring when the Kremlin gained a throne without a heart. In those months, the Great Kremlin was less a palace than a besieged fortress, where every door could open onto a battlefield. After Elena Glinskaya's death, the struggle for the regency became a cold civil war, not fought in the streets but under the palace roof, between clans, families, and bloodlines. The Shuiskys, descendants of the oldest Rurikid line, believed they alone had the right to hold the ruler's seal. Their power came from tradition, from land, from old treaties and oaths. They despised the Glinskys, outsiders, Lithuanian in spirit. To them, Elena would always be a foreigner, a woman tolerated only for the sake of her son. After her death, they decided to restore pure blood to Moscow. But standing in their way were the Belskys, a younger noble branch, related to Elena and allied with Telepnev-Obolensky. They were reformers at heart, the people Elena trusted with the treasury, the mint, and foreign negotiations. After her death, the Belskys tried to keep reforms on course, but they had no sword, only papers, signatures, and the last of their influence. The first clash did not happen on a field but in the refectory. According to the chronicles, Prince Ivan Shuisky publicly refused to sit at the same table with Elena's half-brother, Mikhail Glinsky. "I will not share bread with one whose blood is Lithuanian," he said. The next day, Glinsky's cook was found poisoned. No one investigated. Then the blackmail began. The Shuiskys spread gossip that Elena had lived with Telepnev while her husband still lived. They claimed Ivan IV was illegitimate. These words were not written into chronicles, but they spread through Moscow like a slow poison, from mouth to ear. Telepnev, a man with a soldier's face and a clerk's eyes, became a target. He was seen at Elena's funeral, standing apart in a black cloak without insignia.
One Moscow priest recorded that Telepnev ordered the Terem's doors sealed immediately after the princess's death, not even admitting relatives. From then on, the Shuiskis called him the Widow's Guard and the Black Regent. All that remained of Elena's authority concentrated in one room, the Boyar's chamber. The key to that room was kept by Telepnev. That became the excuse. One May evening, Prince Ivan Shuisky, escorted by dozens of armed men, burst into the quarters. Telepnev had no time to draw a sword. They seized and bound him, and before the eyes of little Ivan proclaimed him an enemy of the state. They say the boy screamed, the first cry since his mother's death. That scream reached even the cells of the Kremlin monastery. The chronicler wrote, "That night a spirit of malice rose, and anger began to break mercy." Telepnev was thrown into prison, where he died 6 months later, some of starvation, others of torture. His property was divided among the Shuiskis. The Glinskys lost every office. Moscow seemed to have returned to the old order, where lineage decided, not reform. Yet by seizing Telepnev, the Shuiskis brought down a curse on themselves. Little Ivan remembered everything.
Later chronicles note, "From that time the Tsar hated all princes who cling to old blood. That hatred did not come from his father, but from that night, the night when the man in the black cloak vanished from his childhood, and the Shuiskis' footsteps filled the Kremlin again." Official records list Ivan Fyodorovich Telepnev Obolensky at court simply as a voivode, guardian of the Grand Princely Chambers. But documents lie. In the archives survive odd papers, orders signed by ELENA GLINSKAYA with his personal seal beside her signature. That means she did not merely trust him with tasks, he had the right to act in her name. In correspondence with the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire, there is a subtle note. The regent of Moscovia acts under the advice of a young prince who never leaves her, day or night. For a 16th century European, this line was almost an accusation, because in diplomatic code, never leaving at night meant not service, but a liaison. Historians argue over what bound them, calculation, passion, or fear. But one thing is clear. After Vasily III's death, Telepnev was the first to enter the widow's rooms. He took charge of guarding the Terems, replaced the servants, changed the guards. He became her armor in a world that forgave no woman power or independence without a husband. Contemporaries describe him as silent, a face carved from stone. He did not drink, did not play dice, avoided feasts. He had the reputation of a fanatic, devoted to one cause and one woman. In later folk tales, he would be called the widow's shadow. Yet that shadow gave Elena a chance to survive. Telepnev knew how to speak with voivodes, how to pressure the treasury, how to remove opposition without bloodshed. He disarmed doubters not with the sword, but with paper. His method was simple: force an enemy to choose submission or disappearance. The boyars hated him. They could not tolerate a woman ruling through a lover, and one not of the senior houses. The Shuiskis called him the new Razin, though the real Razin would not appear for another century. What angered them was not Telepnev's origin, but that he had become Elena's reflection, cold, calculating, unafraid to act. Rumors multiplied. A German merchant at the embassy court wrote in his notes, "I hear the widow keeps secret friendship with the voivode, and this man holds sway over her by Eastern charms." In Moscow tradition, Eastern charms was no mere metaphor. People believed Elena had brought from Lithuania knowledge of herbs and powders that could strip a person of will. Some later chroniclers even claimed that Telepnev was not her lover but a medium, an intermediary between her and the spirit of her deceased husband. It sounds insane, but remember the context. The 16th century, a time of fear of magic, faith in blood and symbols. A woman who retained influence after her husband's death was automatically branded a witch.
The fact remains. Without Telepnev, ELENA would not have held the throne for even a month. It was he who forced the boyars to swear loyalty to the young Ivan. He who pushed through the monetary reform, and he who crushed the Moscow uprisings.
His name appeared beneath every decree until the night the Shuiskys broke down the door. After his arrest, ELENA refused food. Some sources claim she tried to send him letters through the monasteries, but none ever reached him. When his body was found in the dungeon, his face was unrecognizable. People whispered he had died like a dog, but the monks who washed the body swore they found something carved into his chest. 2 interlocking rings, a symbol of eternal loyalty. A week later, ELENA fell ill. And if one asks what truly marked the beginning of her end, poison or love, the answer is the same. They were one and the same. When people speak of Elena Glinskaya, they usually recall her intrigues, her death, the poison, and the rumors. But the real revolution she left behind did not happen in bedchambers or the terems. It happened in the mint. Under her rule, Muscovy for the first time in its history became a country with a single currency. For her age, this was audacity, even blasphemy, the power of a woman who chose to impose order on the chaos of men's deaths. By the early 1530s, the Russian economy was a patchwork of fiefs, each with its own coins, weights, and measures. Trade faltered, fraud thrived, and the treasury bled revenue. ELENA, a widow unexpectedly at the head of the state, understood. To hold the throne, she needed not priests' blessings, but control of silver. Chroniclers describe how she personally attended treasury meetings, not hidden behind a screen as custom demanded, but seated beside the coinmasters. She listened, questioned, weighed the coins with her fingers as though checking the empire's pulse. For the 16th century, this was a rupture in the order of the cosmos. A woman among men's work, counting metal instead of prayers. Telepnev backed her. He knew that coin was stronger than any decree. In 1535, under her command, a reform began that would later be called the monetary cleansing. Old coins were to be melted down, new ones struck bearing the image of a horseman with a spear, a symbol of unified power. Thus the kopeck was born, the first truly statewide currency. But every reform in Russia begins with enemies. The boyars whispered that the new coin carried the devil's mark because it bore no cross. Merchants complained the silver was lighter, the weight diminished. People muttered that the money has shriveled like a body without a soul. In monasteries, preachers called it the widow's sin, and ELENA herself a servant of Latin faith. In reply, she ordered the weighing of all church offerings. It was a challenge, almost a mockery. If they called her a witch, then let the witch weigh their gold. Western envoys were astonished. In one letter, a Polish diplomat wrote, "This woman thinks like Emperor Charles. She rules not by weakness of sex, but by strength of mind." But in Moscow, her resolve inspired not respect, but superstitious dread. It was at this time the first rumor of enchanted silver arose. They said one night in the Kremlin courtyard, molten coins suddenly flared with blue fire, a sign the metal was cursed. Others swore the new coins bore Telepnev's face, hidden beneath the rider's helmet. Chroniclers denied it, but the legend spread. All this unfolded against a backdrop of growing isolation. After the reform, ELENA drifted from the clergy, severed ties with the Boyar Council, and concentrated power in a small circle of loyalists, treasurers, craftsmen, clerks. Historians note that here, for the first time, Muscovy discovered the idea of parties. At court, they spoke of the copper, those who clung to the new coin, and the silver, the old nobility who lived by ancient ways.
Copper and silver clashed, not in markets, but in the streets. In February 1536, riots broke out in Moscow. Crowds stormed shops, demanding the return of the old money. Elena was accused of stealing the people's weight. Rumors spread that in one courtyard, a mob burned a storehouse of new coins, and they melted like blood in the sun. Her response was merciless. The executions began the next morning. Chronicles record that 5 rioters were hanged on Red Square, and dozens more were sent to hard labor in the Solovki. The streets fell silent. But to the nobility, she was no longer a widow. She had become a tyrant. For the first time, chronicles used the phrase, "the terrible Tsaritsa," never spoken aloud in court, but in whispers among the people. She is like a storm, and after her, everything burns. The irony is that this terrible Tsaritsa built the financial system Russia would live under for nearly 3 centuries. Her reform outlived her enemies, outlived her son, outlived even the idea of Muscovite autocracy itself. Yet in 1536, no one could know the coin she had unleashed would become her curse. On one specimen unearthed by archaeologists, the stamp slipped. The rider seems to be falling from his horse. People said, "It is a sign." Thus began her final spring. The spring of 1538 entered the chronicles not with wars or uprisings, but with one brief line. And the great Princess Elena, wife of Vasily, passed suddenly of a strange illness. That strange illness remains a mystery. Behind the official words lay poison, the kind that does not kill at once, but extinguishes slowly, like a candle in still air. Witnesses said it began with a cup of milk. Weary and pale after a meeting with the boyars, Elena asked for a drink. A servant brought a silver cup, the very one she had kept with her since Telepnev's death. An hour later, she felt heat. By dawn, aching bones, then misted eyes. Chroniclers wrote, "Her braids fell from her head, and she knew no light. No one dared summon healers from among the people. Only monastic physicians brought under cover of night." One of them, Theodosius, left a record. Her body burned like iron from the forge, and her blood darkened as lead. Today, historians believe it was a slow poison based on mercury. The irony, mercury was then used in alchemy to purify metals. She died from the very element she had used to purify her realm. The regent's death shook Moscow, not from love, but from fear. With her vanished the last person who held power. The 3-year-old Tsar was left defenseless. That same night, as Elena's body was placed in the coffin, panic broke out in the Kremlin. It is said her personal chest of seals and treasury keys disappeared from the vault. By morning, those same seals were in the hands of the Shuiskys. But it wasn't only the gold that disappeared. Her papers were gone too. Private letters, decrees, records of reforms. It was as if they were erasing her, not just from life, but from memory.
By order of the boyars, even her portrait, painted by a master from Pskov, was taken from the wall and burned for its excess of earthly likeness. They buried her at dawn. No ceremony, no bells, only monks and a few servants. One chronicler added, "That day was dark, and the birds were silent." Days later, a rumor spread in Moscow that a scroll had been found in her coffin. Written in red ink were the words, "Her son will not forget that his mother was slain by men." This legend became the curse of the Glinskys. People whispered that Elena, before death, had cursed all who would touch her child. And indeed, within a week, one Shusky died suddenly, bleeding from the ears. A month later, another drowned in the Moscow River. Superstitious townsfolk swore it was her shadow taking revenge. Servants who tended young Ivan said that at night he did not cry from fear, but from anger. One nurse claimed he spoke in his sleep, "I will burn them as they burned her." 20 years later, when he unleashed the Oprichnina, those who remembered those words said it was his mother's curse fulfilled. There is also a colder version, political. Many believe the true instigator of her death was Prince Ivan Shusky. His men controlled her food, her healers, her every breath. He knew that while she lived, power was beyond his reach. Her death cleared the path to the regency. And the day after her funeral, it was he who presided over the Boyar Council. Yet one detail chills the blood. When her body was washed, the nuns found black dust beneath her fingernails. Not soil, not soot, but powder like ground metal. That was how poison was made from silver sand, a method known only to alchemists. Some historians even suggest it may have been suicide, that Elena, knowing she was being poisoned, drank the mixture herself to hasten the end. Whatever the truth, her death was a turning point. A woman who began as a reformer ended as a ghost. In memory, she was not a widow, not a mother of a czar, but the princess who died of Mercury. In that image, all things merged: her power, her solitude, her intellect, and the price of her defiance. When her body was carried into the Archangel Cathedral, the candle at her head went out by itself. The monks took it as a sign: she has not reconciled with the earth. And people said that on March nights, when the thawing snow slides from the Kremlin's roofs, you can hear a faint tapping at her tomb, as if someone is counting coins. Then the old folk cross themselves and whisper, "It is Elena, collecting the debt from those who sold her." After Elena Glinskaya's death, the Kremlin grew hollow. The stone walls, once alive with her steps and her voice, now rang with silence. The child Tsar remained among men too afraid even to speak his mother's name. His nurses whispered prayers, while the boyars divided power beneath his windows, as he, barely able to hold a spoon, watched. They say Ivan searched for her. Every morning he asked, "Call for Mama." They told him she was sleeping. Then he ordered, "Wake her." In his eyes grew something darker than grief, a wound that hardened into rage. He saw the fur-clad men enter his rooms, shouting, tearing papers, arguing over seals. None looked at him as a sovereign, only as the token of their own power. The Shuskys ruled in his name, but never for his sake. They quarreled over who stood closer to the throne, who had the right to the seal. Little Ivan grew up among lies and fear. Chroniclers remembered how he began to play at court, seating toy boyars and passing judgment on them. Sometimes he ordered them beaten with sticks. The servants laughed, not realizing it was rehearsal for the future. At night, he wandered through the halls where his mother had once walked. One eunuch swore that Ivan pressed his palm to the cold stone floor and whispered, "Cold like a grave." Around that time, the first cruelties appeared. He plucked feathers from pigeons, strangled kittens, not in malice, but as if testing what it meant to hold life and death. The Shuskys did not interfere.
It suited them that the boy remained strange, isolated, without friends. They even forbade him to study outside the palace, fearing knowledge would make him dangerous. But Ivan taught himself. He listened to the men around him, memorizing every name, every insult. Once he saw guards dragging through the courtyard the body of a eunuch who had dared speak the truth about Elena's death. The next morning, the boy demanded a quill and paper. On it, he scratched his first word, Mama. That was the beginning of his letter to the future. When he turned 8, he spoke aloud for the first time. I remember those who killed her. A servant nearby swore that at that moment a log cracked in the fireplace, as if in confirmation. From that day forward, Ivan ceased to be a child. Later he would say, I was fed on milk mixed with poison, not as metaphor, but as truth. From that on, poison became his language. Her name was no longer spoken in decrees, yet her presence lingered in everything. Even years later, courtiers feared to say Elena aloud, as if the very sound carried the scent of scorched metal. In every decision of the young Ivan, in every flash of his rage, her hand could be felt, cold, firm, reaching from the grave to guide her son. When Ivan grew older, he surrounded himself with women who reminded him of her, imperious, proud, with eyes that showed no fear. Yet none matched the figure he carried in memory. They said he often visited the Archangel Cathedral where she lay, standing silently, never crossing himself. One monk swore he once heard the Tsar whisper, "They thought they killed you, but I am your voice." Later, psychologists would say, what Ivan inherited from her was not power, but loneliness. Like his mother, he trusted no one. His court became a mirror of her regency, filled with denunciations, executions, fear. Only now the ritual of testing was turned on men. Boyars were subjected to torture, and their confessions were written down the same way women's purity once had been. Many noticed a strange pattern. Every man involved in the plot against Elena perished in the first years of Ivan's reign. The Shuiskis, strangled, poisoned, exiled. Not one escaped. It seemed the boy had truly carried out his mother's curse. People whispered, she returned in his face. Even his state emblem bore her trace. After Elena's monetary reform, coins were struck with a horseman bearing a spear. Ivan elevated that figure into the empire's central symbol, Saint George the Victorious. But the elders muttered, that is no saint, that is her, avenging without end. In the legends collected under the Romanovs, one tale stands out. They said that once, during a thunderstorm, Ivan ordered his mother's coffin opened and her ring taken from it. He commanded that the stone be set into his cross, to be closer to her strength. From then on, people said, whenever his anger rose, the stone darkened. Historians debate how much of this is true. But one thing is certain, Elena lived in his mind as both icon and ghost. She taught him that rule was not about mercy, but fear. And he carried that lesson across all of Russia. When Ivan created the Oprichnina, he repeated her rituals. Only where she had silver, he had black velvet. He never realized he was copying her, the secret lists, the faith in purifying pain, the same cold calculation. Only now, the blood flowed not in drops, but in rivers. In a letter to Prince Kurbsky,
Ivan once wrote, "My mother has not died. She is in my every decision." Kurbsky called it madness. In truth, it was confession. The Russia he ruled was not new. It was her continuation. Her death opened the way to an age where love and power became synonyms for fear. Her coin, her reform, her poison, all became the first stones in the wall behind which Ivan the Terrible would rise. When he died, the monks said, "Two souls left that body, his and his mother's. For until his last breath, he never freed himself from her voice." And perhaps that is why Russian history begins not with a czar, but with a woman who once dared to melt down metal. No hymns were written to her. In the chronicles, her name was smudged, as if the pages themselves darkened at its mention. But if one looks closely at the fabric of Russian history, every thread is held by an unseen hand, ELENA GLINSKAYA's hand. She was the woman who dared to take power in a land where women were meant to be silent. And for that, she was never forgiven, her mind, her defiance, or her beauty. When her contemporaries spoke of her, their voices trembled with contradiction. A holy witch, a sovereign who spoke with the tongue of men, a temptress who destroyed noble lines. But behind all the words lay fear. Fear of a woman who understood that rule depended not on blessing, but on calculation. She entered history not as the mother of Ivan the Terrible, but as his mirror. He became the embodiment of what she had created, absolute power forged in fear and mistrust. In him, Russia reflected her own shadows, reform, blood, and curse. They say that when old coins ring faintly in the Kremlin at night, it is her reform echoing, silver, purified of alloy, yet infused with her breath. When a candle smokes in the Archangel Cathedral, it is not smoke but her whisper, drifting through the centuries. Her life was like alchemy. From pain she drew power, from power solitude, from solitude legend. Her body long ago became dust, but the formula remains. A woman who rules among wolves must become one of them. So ended ELENA GLINSKAYA, not on the scaffold, not in exile, but in silence louder than all the church bells. From her grave rose a shadow that still rules Russia, cold, calculating, female.